Now it's time to talk about chivalry. Let's start with the word itself, chivalry. Chivalry is an English anglicized version of a French noun, chevalerie. It's basically the same word. Well, chevalerie means horsiness. Well, not exactly. It's based on chevalier, which is the French word for a horseman. The horse itself is the cheval. And so the chevalier, one who horses, is the knight. And chivalry is knighthood, knightliness. So when we're talking about chivalry, what we really mean is a code that governs how a knight should behave. What makes a knight from the standpoint of behavior, not from the standpoint of equipment and social status and things we were talking about last time. So in addition to that stuff we did talk about before, feudalism, the refining of mounted warrior, all that kind of stuff, there are two other streams that are feeding into chivalry. So the first stream is the religious. And these are grounded in the medieval church's attempts to restrain violence, especially violence against other Christians and violence against the defenseless. Because there was a lot of that going on. You got these great, strong, fighting men, and now you've given them heavy armor and put them on horses, and they kind of feel invincible. And so they're just riding all over the place, oppressing the masses. And the church is like, but you're Christians. You're not supposed to do that. That's not the teaching of the gospel. And so they began to try to find ways to restrain these guys and bring them in. And the biggest innovation, the big idea the church had was, you know what? We need to reframe what it means to be a knight. To be a knight doesn't mean to be strong and powerful and to be able to impose your will on anyone. To be a knight means to be a soldier for Christ. That's really what knighthood is all about. Even before the Crusades, there was a sense it was shifting towards, we need to. You're giving this strength for a reason, for a purpose, right? With great strength comes great responsibility to protect those who don't have strength. The Crusades, however, really lock this in. They're really big for the development of this notion, because the Crusades. One of the things that is being brought to bear in the Crusades is the Pope will say, hey, stop killing Christians when there are unbelievers to be killed over there. Now, this isn't just hey, go wipe out people who aren't us. We have to remember the Crusades are a response to reports that were coming into Europe that pilgrims, Christian and Jewish pilgrims, on the road to Jerusalem were being not only robbed and detained by the Muslims who live there, but that they were being raped, that they were being horribly tortured and murdered in horrific ways, that they got very graphic descriptions of coming to them from the East. This may not have been true. We don't know for sure. It's the Middle Ages. There's a lot we don't know. But it's quite possible that those things weren't actually happening, or weren't happening to the degree or as a widespread level as that was reported they were. But that's actually not what's important. What's important is, as far as the Christians in the West knew, these things were happening. And they were compassionate about it. They wanted to do something to stop it. Certainly the Pope did. And so the Pope calls everyone to say, hey, guys, stop killing everybody. Let's go over there. All the killing's going over there now. That's where the killing's going to happen. So when you preach a crusade, you include, the preaching of a crusade comes with two bans. The first is a ban on wars. There were to be no wars among Christian princes for 2 years. I'm not saying that worked, but that was one of the conditions that the church would lay down when preaching a crusade. The second is a ban on tournaments. No knightly tournaments. Why? Because tournaments are dangerous. Jousting is meant to kill the other person. And when you joust at a tournament, you can't necessarily stop that from happening. You got to do your best, and you're doing your best typically means killing the other guy. So it's not that every time two knights jousted, somebody died, but it seems to be. I mean, you could almost make the statement that every time a tournament was held, somebody died. So if you went to a tournament, you should expect that at least one of the knights there is going to be killed, which is an awful waste to die for fun over here when you could be dying to protect the defenseless over there. So there's a Bernard of Clairvaux, who is famous for being one of the great mystical minds of the church. He wrote a book called On the New Knighthood, which he wrote to the Knights Templar as a sort of theological justification and underpinning for their existence to help them understand what they were doing theologically. And this is something he says in that book. He says, this is a quote, "But let the knights of Christ fight the battles of their Lord in security, in no way fearing that they sin in the slaughter of the enemy, nor that they incur danger at their own death. For whenever death is either inflicted or suffered for Christ's sake, it is both not a crime and deserves much glory. For in the former, when death is inflicted, glory is gained for Christ by killing those who are oppressing and murdering followers of Christ. In the latter, when one is killed for Christ, one gains Christ, who freely and unsurprisingly accepts the death of the enemy as punishment, and who freely offers his own self to the knight as consolation." So if you're squaring off with an infidel, if you kill them, that's God's judgment on them. If they kill you, you gain Christ as consolation for your efforts. If you want to see a really beautiful, highly developed literary take on all of this, Tasso's Liberation of Jerusalem deals with this really, really well. In that text, you see, as the Crusaders are fighting the Muslims, the Crusaders who've been killed earlier in the text, they're helping the army by their prayers. And so, like Obi-Wan Kenobi, they've become more powerful by being struck down than they were when they were there physically present. So all of this stuff, it's a whole other thing that's being added into the development of chivalry. So knightly duties now encompass all of that social stuff we saw as your political duties to your lord in response for holding your land and that sort of a thing. And also these religious duties to use your strength to defend the faith, to defend the defenseless, and to restrain those who would use their power to hurt others. A third stream that comes into this is something called courtesy or courtliness. Courtliness has it's the set of manners that grow up around courts. Courts are very artificial, right? Everything is very random. A lot of times it starts out because the king has foibles, right? I think about in Iron Man. I think we see this for the first time in maybe in Avengers, where we find out that Tony Stark doesn't like to be handed things. And so someone wants to hand him something, he doesn't want to take it, and then Pepper will take it and hand it to him. No, we saw it in Iron Man 2, actually. That's really weird. Like, that's so silly. That's a strange foible that Tony Stark has. But if Tony Stark were the king, then you would know never to hand anything to the king, because if you did, he might get mad and you might wind up in jail or lose a hand or lose your life, right? And so what happens is all the other nobles start imitating it. Now nobody likes to be handed things, and stuff's just lying around everywhere because nobody can hand anything to anybody else. And so in this court, the custom is, if I want to give you this, I set it down and then you go pick it up. Well, imagine if I'm coming from a different court, or if I'm coming from the countryside, and I brought a lovely pumpkin from my garden for the king, my prized pumpkin, and I come in and I reach out to try to hand my pumpkin to the king, and everyone in the court gasps and the king frowns, and my life is in danger and I don't even know why, because that's the weirdness of the court. Over time, this turns into a series of very particular conventions about how to do things that are unique to that court. And of course, as the courts of Europe are in interaction with each other throughout the Middle Ages, these customs begin to spread around to different courts. And so it creates what we've come to think of as aristocratic refinement, which is not so much refinement as it is just we're all randomly going to eat with 10 forks, right? That's not being refined. There's nothing inherently elegant about that. It's just a choice that people made. These relations are highly formalized, and they're modulated by class. So how I relate to someone of my class is highly structured, and how I relate to people of higher and lower classes is highly structured. All of that stuff comes to be part, that's feeding into chivalry, knightly behavior as well. On top of that, there's the development of this thing called courtly love. Courtly love is a major part of what's going on in the courts. What it is a system of conventions which turns into rules on how one is to do romantic love. It emphasized passion and romance, generally outside the bonds of marriage. And so I have a whole other video on this that I'll link down below that you can follow up on, but just some of a sample of some of the rules of courtly love, that would govern how a knight would behave in court if he was in love with someone. The first rule is marriage is not a proper cause to be excused from love, which means just because you're married to somebody doesn't mean you can't be in love with somebody. Now, it's understood you're not going to be in love with that person you married. That was an arranged marriage of political convenience. So you can't say, if there's a handsome knight in your court and he's interested in you, you can't give the excuse, well, I'm married to your lord, because marriage isn't an excuse. It doesn't get you out of it. No, that's not you can, so what? So you're married. We can still fool around, is what courtly love would say. Love is always either increasing or decreasing. That's the passion thing, right? If you're not getting more and more in love, you're becoming less and less in love. Love is rarely accustomed to endure being made public. It's dangerous, practically, because, again, these two guys aren't married. She's married to somebody else, and this guy is a knight who owes service to the guy that she's married to, and so if he finds out that she's sleeping with him, they're both going to get murdered. I mean, that's a done deal. But also, this secrecy adds relish to it, and all of that forbiddenness is brought to the fore as this is just part of the game. This is what knights do. Knights are sneaking around with girls all the time. The heart of the lover trembles upon suddenly seeing the beloved. The one full of love is always full of fear. Oh, what if she doesn't like me? What if she's seeing somebody else? What if they find out? The one who is vexed by thoughts of love eats and sleeps less. Oh, I can't eat. I'm just thinking about her. Right? Every act of the lover ends in thought of the beloved. It's a really weird and not really... It's a weird and bankrupt way of loving, actually. It probably doesn't seem as weird to us as it should, because this is still how we do it. This is the major source of modern notions of romance. That's why we call it romance, because it's how the knights acted in the tales, the French stories written about King Arthur's court. So, originally, these courtly loves governed how members of the court should behave towards one another if they did get involved in the love game. But they came to be considered not just rules of how court members behaved, but actually duties of a knight. Not just something a knight can do, but the way a knight is expected to behave. And we'll come back to that in just a second, because as you may have picked up, it's not entirely possible to satisfy all of these demands at once. Courtly love might demand that you give your heart to the lady of the castle because she's caught your eye, but your political duty, your social duty to your lord would say not to do that because that's his wife and that's treason. Because if you get her pregnant, we can't tell whose kid that is. And so that muddies succession and could lead to civil war. It's not good for the body as a whole. And the church would tell you that's wrong. Your religious obligation was that a disciple of Christ shouldn't be having adulterous relationships with anybody, much less his Lord's wife. So these two things came into conflict, right? And here's some examples of that. There are some common demands. There's some things that all three of these duties would sort of have in mind. I'm specifically interested in the conflict between the religious and the courtly. I'm not going to talk as much about the social thing. But the religious and the courtly gave some common demands. First of all, defend the helpless. In the courtly code, that means women. Knights were to be especially concerned to protect women. And in the Christian code, that meant everybody. If they're weaker than you, protect them. Generosity is required by both. Christians, generous for the sake of Christ, and the courtly code, generous because it shows your good character. Mercy belongs to both. Faithfulness belongs to both. That's funny because in the courtly code, it might require you to be unfaithful to your Lord, but it requires you to be faithful to your beloved. In a sense, your lady love becomes your new Lord in the courtly realm of things. Now, here's some things that courtliness demands that are unique to courtliness. It requires treating every woman as if you were in love with her in order to hide which one you really are in love with. If I flirt with everybody, then you can't tell that one of these people I'm flirting with is real. And if you happen to come to believe that the flirting is real with one of them, you can't tell which one because I treat them all the same publicly. In fact, there's some courtly love texts that say that you should actually spurn the one that you like. You should never talk to her in public and act as if you don't care for her or like her at all. You can't stand her. And then you get in private, and it's a very different story. Because of this, there is this obligation to flirt with all women, and you should not refuse the offer of love without a good reason. And the only really good reason is you're already in a love relationship with somebody else. So if someone comes up and propositions you, unless you're already doing illicit courtly love stuff with somebody else, you kind of have an obligation to respond in kind and let that relationship develop. A knight without a lady is almost as scandalous as a knight without armor. It's just part of the equipment. It's one of the things you got to have if you're a knight. Courtliness demands refinement in dress and manner, and it demands concern for one's reputation. You're always looking out to make sure that you have a good name and a good reputation and that sort of thing. By contrast, the Christian faith demands chastity. So no fooling around with another man's wife, no fooling around with any woman who's not your wife, in which case it's not fooling around, so just no fooling around, all right? Just wise around. It also demands poverty, where poverty is understood not as you have to not have stuff, you have to be literally poor, but it means a lack of attachment to the goods in this world. Not looking to the goods in this world as being that important, right? You can use them, but you've got to use them with an eye to what I really care about is spiritual goods. That doesn't line up well with the refinement in dress and manner that courtliness requires. And it requires humility, which is kind of the opposite of concern for one's reputation. Humility isn't making sure that nobody says good things about you or saying bad things about yourself. Humility is not thinking about yourself at all. You're concerned for other people and not thinking about yourself. So you can't be concerned for your reputation and be humble at the same time. Those things are in conflict with each other. The best instance of this conflict of duties in literature is Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Everyone focuses on it's common to focus on, oh, Gawain's got this huge test coming up and he's trying to survive, and he made this promise to the lord of the castle, and then he doesn't keep it because he said he'd give him whatever he got, but he doesn't give him the girdle, and so that's really the thing. That's not what this text is primarily about. That's why is so much of the text, the vast majority of it, about his encounters with Bertilac's wife. It's because that is where the rubber hits the road. She is saying, you have this reputation throughout the world for being one of the most courtly knights. Prove it. And so she's trying to get him to have sex with her because that's what courtly love would demand. And he should be, while he's in her castle, he should be her servant and do what she wants and give her all the stuff, and then he'll move on and do other things later. And in fact, that's what Gawain is like in the early stories, in the French tales. He's got a girl in every castle, right? But he doesn't want to do that because he's on his shield. He's got the Virgin Mary, and he's supposed to be thinking about her. And he's constantly trying to think about his Christian duty and not give in to this courtly temptation, which would cause him to violate his Christian responsibility. And you'll see he calls upon Jesus, he calls upon God, and as he's getting defeated, he's backing down, and he calls upon Mary, and then he ultimately gives in a bit on the last day. The two different codes that he has represented on his shield, the religious code by the Virgin Mary and the courtly code by the Pentangle, he can't live up to both of them at the same time because they're incompatible. And so the text ends in a very ambiguous failure where the Knights of Camelot don't think he's failed at all because they don't see anything wrong with it. They would have gone on. They would have had the wife multiple times over if they'd been there. They're completely given over to the chivalrous code. But by the Christian code, he's completely failed because he has given in to this temptation. Not the temptation to protect his life, the temptation to trade favors and allow himself to be tempted and give in somewhat to the temptation with this woman. There are other instances of this of the conflict between these values, though. One is there's a common prohibition in religious texts against monks owning hawks. What? Why? because hawks are the devil's bird and they'll swallow your soul. No, that's not it. Why do you care if monks have hawks or not? Well, because hawks are really expensive to train. If you think it's expensive to have your dog trained, try getting a hawk trained. And the only reason to pay all that money to train a hawk is so you can go hunting with it, where hunting is one of the major courtly activities. It's the big leisure activity. It's like in some sectors of our society, we think of people who go golfing or play polo as though that's a rich person activity and they do these kinds of things. That's what hawking is. And so a monk is clearly chasing after worldly riches and worldly acclaim if he is going hawking. And that's why they're not allowed to do it. Chaucer will often point out this conflict by means of parody. So he talks about the prioress, whose mind ought to be filled with love of God. And she has this little motto, amor vincit omnia, love conquers all. But she's not really talking about the divine love, because in her manner, she's striving to be like a high lady of the court and striving to be refined in that sort of a way. Same thing with the monk. The Chaucer's monk is very interested in things like hawking and hunting and all that sort of a thing. Exactly what he's not supposed to be interested in. Now, besides all this stuff, so all of these things are part of chivalry. If you're a knight, all of this stuff is in the air. This is all, you've got to juggle all these different demands. But there's more. Because chivalry, of course, has to also include the warrior virtues: strength, prowess, hardiness, and the feudal virtues of faithful service, defense of the interest of one's lord, and good stewardship of one's fief. All of that stuff, the religious, the courtly, the martial, and the feudal, are duties a knight must constantly attend to, and together they constitute chivalry. The writers of the early romances in the 12th century who popularized these values chose King Arthur's knights as their setting, elevating his court as the pinnacle and paragon of chivalry. Geoffrey of Monmouth says, he's the historian, he says that Arthur's court became so famous that all the other courts in Europe wanted to imitate his court. They wanted to dress like they dressed and act like they acted. Chivalry in his story spreads from Arthur's court to all of Europe. That's what literally happens in a literary fashion, is that by putting this particular vision of chivalry on the Knights of the Round Table, as those tales became wildly popular, that chivalry spread all over Europe and became the norm for the West, and has left deep and abiding marks on Western culture that we still are not only feeling, but in many ways trapped by today. So that's the piece together then. So now the knighthood that we talked about last time, and the chivalry as the code of how a knight should behave, by the time we get to the second half of the 12th century, both of those things are in place, which means now it's possible to have the knights of the sort that we normally think about when we think about the court of King Arthur.